She rocked their world. She was a stick of feminist dynamite tossed down the starched white shirts of America's patriarchal establishment. She was a perpetual percolator, churning against those who preferred their society and spirituality to be suppressed, stagnant, and staid. For her, life was a self-made intellectual and experiential adventure, a chance to cultivate the human mind, heart, and intuition. In a world that expected subservient conformity for women, she broke the mold, remaking herself into this magnificent mystic who unleashed this country's women's rights movement. She was Margaret Fuller, the spiritual godmother of modern Unitarian Universalism. We would not be here today as Unitarian Universalists without her. Yet, why do so few of us know her name? Why doesn't Margaret Fuller blaze as brightly as her friends and intellectual equals of the early and mid-1800s? Men such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Why is her name not said with reverence? A leader in the 19th century intellectual flowering of America, known as the Transcendentalism, Margaret Fuller has been pruned from our collective consciousness. And I would argue deliberately, because of her gender. Consider just a few, and I mean just a few, of her many accomplishments. Margaret Fuller was the first literary editor of a major U.S. metropolitan newspaper, the New York Tribune. She was the first major U.S. foreign correspondent, spending 4 years reporting in Europe. She was one of 19th century America's most highly paid public lecturers. Margaret Fuller was a celebrated author of 5 books and almost 350 articles, essays, and poems. She was the first woman to set foot in and use Harvard University's library, which had previously been restricted to men only. You go, Margaret. And most notably, Margaret Fuller was and is the author of the first book on women's rights written by an American. Biographer Eve Kornfeld writes, Margaret Fuller's friends and foes alike agree that she was an unforgettable central figure in early 19th century America. The Unitarian philosopher and author Ralph Waldo Emerson considered her a shining light in his intellectual circle. He wrote, Margaret Fuller was wise, sincere, accomplished. Her mind and spirit so impressed Emerson that he was unable to imagine anyone more variously gifted, wise, sportive, or eloquent who seems to have learned all languages. As Margaret Fuller once said, I now know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own. Margaret Fuller, friends, was all of this in the early 1800s, at a time when women had no right to vote, had limited access to education, and faced overwhelming social pressure to remain silent and subservient. Margaret Fuller was also a faithful Unitarian who stretched herself spiritually and ultimately embraced a new, authentic, and natural relationship with her higher power, a oneness in all creation that she called God. Margaret Fuller was born on May 23rd, 1810 in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts. She was born into a white Unitarian middle-class family. Oh, and her ordinary years were not ordinary. She recounts an emotionally stifling childhood, one she describes as being filled with, quote, glooms and terrors. In her memoirs, she said she had, quote, no natural childhood. To understand why Margaret Fuller says her childhood was not natural, we got to remember what gender meant in the early 1800s and how gender roles were carefully constructed. As biographer Eve Cornfield states, early 19th century American culture fostered the belief in a dualistic opposition of masculinity and femininity. Popular literature and science supported the idea that gender was binary and men and women had a different inherent essential nature. They said women were compassionate, self-effacing, and mentally inferior. Men, on the other hand, were rational, selfish, and intellectually superior. You can hiss at that if you want. To challenge these gender roles and binary boundaries meant to be branded unnatural, for these cultural constructions were taken to be unchanging and unchangeable and divinely ordained by God. The social inferiority of women, it was widely believed, even among Unitarians, was God's design. What God had put in place, let no man and certainly no woman pull asunder. Author Eve Cornfield says that, quote, different methods for educating boys and girls reinforced these beliefs. Language itself became divided according to gender. Middle-class boys studied the classics, mathematics, natural science, history, and theology, and they learned an aggressive language suitable for debate. Those few middle-class girls who attended female academies and finishing schools studied literature, art, languages, dance, and music. They were taught deliberately a docile language intended to soothe and smooth over controversy. The different interests, talents, and modes of expressions of girls and boys, carefully cultivated during their formative years at home and at school, were then taken as further proof of this natural gulf between the male and female worlds. Margaret Fuller and her childhood upended all this. Although she was a girl, she was intellectually and temperamentally raised as a boy. Her father, who had no desire for a daughter, raised Margaret's mind as if she were his son. As Dr. Tandeka recounts, quote, Margaret Fuller's father, Timothy Fuller Jr., was also her tutor. He was a staunch old-line Unitarian rationalist, a lawyer who had served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. He tyrannically ruled over every aspect of Margaret's life, endeavoring to raise her as the boy he had wanted. Paternal love from this man was earned rather than freely given. If Margaret achieved, she had worth. If she did not, she was not loved. Thus, Margaret Fuller became the ultimate overachiever. She could read and write by the age of 3. By 6, she was translating Virgil from Latin into English. By the time Margaret Fuller was 9, she read literature in 4 languages and wrote literary critiques of major European philosophic and literary texts. Tandeka continues, she developed a confident language of analysis and debate. The little girl learned to argue like a boy. As biographer writes, each night at the end of Margaret's grueling day of scholarship, when her father returned home from work late at night, he would awaken her and make her for hours recount what she had learned during the day. Reflecting on the years she endured this paternal invasive abuse, Fuller said, quote, I did not go mad, as many would. I had too much strength to be crushed. And since I must put on the fetters, I could not submit to let them impede my motions. My own world, Margaret Fuller said, sank deep within, away from the surface of my life. But my true life was only the dearer that it was secluded and veiled over by a thick curtain of available intellect. This turning within allowed Margaret Fuller to slowly develop a deep and imaginative, emotional inner life. This inner world would ultimately prove her salvation. She began to listen to a quiet inner voice, a gentle inner guidance. She began to feel inside the presence of the divine spirit within her. It left her determined to save her life, to claim her life as her own, and by extension, to liberate women from the restrictions of patriarchy. This was not an easy feat, for she would have to bridge the contradictory masculine and feminine identities that had been forced upon her. For although he raised her intellectually as a boy, Margaret Fuller's father never let his daughter forget her passive place in a male-dominated world. Dr. Tandeka writes, Margaret Fuller's father believed the role of a daughter was that of absolute service to him. He was tyrannical. Margaret learned to conform to his absolute desires and expectations as son and as daughter. Her life became a mix of contradictions. As she explained in a letter written in November of 1832, quote, I have 2 souls, and they seem to roll over one another in the most incomprehensible way. All my tastes and wishes point one way and seem forced the other way. To remedy this, Dr. Tandeka observes, Fuller undertook the grueling work of uniting her 2 souls, her male-trained intellect with her inmost personal feelings and intuitions as a woman. She wanted to become an intelligent woman rather than a woman with a man's mind. This union of mind and heart, body and intellect was hard won. And then, one day, when she was 21 years old, while taking a walk home from attending a Sunday service at the Unitarian Church, Margaret Fuller had a powerful transformational moment that changed her life forever, and by extension, changed our lives. She had what she believed was a profound mystical experience with the oneness of all creation. She had just stopped to look at an ordinary stream, but as she watched that stream flow, it was as if she felt she was looking at her own life, and then beyond her own life to the greater all. Margaret Fuller wrote, quote, I paused beside a little stream which I had envied in the merry fullness of its spring life. In summer, it now was shrunken, voiceless, choked with withered leaves. I marveled that it did not quite lose itself in the earth. Suddenly, the sun shone out with transparent sweetness and passed into my thought a beam from the true sun, from its native sphere, a beam of life, light, which has never departed from me. In that moment, Margaret Fuller realized that a profound unity, an essential oneness undergirded the universe. She saw differentiation melt away. The separate became the all. On the deepest level, differences and individual circumstances, she believed, were a human-created illusion because there was only oneness, the all, because creation was all one. She wrote, quote, "I saw that there was no self, that it was only to live with the idea of the all, and all was mine. This truth came to me, and I received it unhesitatingly, so that I was that hour taken up into God." This mystical merging with the all became the foundation for Margaret Fuller to build a life that was uniquely hers and whole, and yet a life that she dedicated to the universal all. Pandeyika writes, "It was at one and the same time a mystical experience and a transformation of herself into a human rights advocate. Anything that separates one person from another, she came to believe, must be deconstructed. This," Eve Kornfeld says, quote, "her unfolding spiritual vision challenged the prevailing social construction of gender. The division of humanity into strict gender spheres," Fuller now believed, was ultimately unnatural, a partition of the universe's true essence of oneness. What was one could not be divided. And so Margaret Fuller became passionate about guiding others to experience the divine essence within all. She loudly proclaimed human rights for all: women, blacks, indigenous people, enslaved persons, imprisoned persons. She wrote prolifically, she lectured widely, and discussed deeply. Margaret Fuller became one of the most influential and popular figures in America. Biographer Kornfeld writes, "She hoped that open discussion of philosophical and social issues would lead women to explore their hidden resources and develop their own voices. She invited women to shed their feminine socialization and to think of themselves first as intelligent human beings. In learning to speak their minds and respect themselves and each other," Margaret Fuller believed, "women could aspire to realize their divine potential. Their deep wisdom and intuition could emerge as purpose and activity as they collectively brought the power and claimed a power to recreate themselves and the world." Margaret Fuller brought this power into our Unitarian faith and into American society at large. Although she didn't live long enough to see it, Margaret Fuller laid the foundation for Seneca Falls and the 1848 launch of the women's rights movement. Unitarians Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton later wrote that Margaret Fuller, quote, "possessed more influence upon the thought of American women than any woman previous to her time." But she was not just a woman for women. Fuller believed that spiritual and social liberation was for all people. She believed all people could be freed from the separating illusion of gender roles, class expectations, racial profiling, and nationalistic posturing. This could be the birth of heaven on earth, Margaret Fuller believed, the bestowing of an earthly, universal salvation for all. We need to be honest. We need to be honest and acknowledge that Margaret Fuller also bumped up against her own limitations regarding gender, race, and class. She was raised and lived in a white-dominant culture and a white-dominant religion. The women she associated with and tried to liberate were primarily upper-class white women. The legacy of whiteness, of racial and class segregation, still inform our contemporary Unitarian Universalist faith. Margaret Fuller also understood gender as only binary, rather than the non-binary reality that our progressive religion now celebrates. But Margaret Fuller's limitations do not mitigate how revolutionary her impact was on America. Who knows what Margaret Fuller could have helped us achieve? Who knows what else she could have thought, written, or envisioned? The last 4 years of her young life were spent abroad as a foreign correspondent, writing and reporting European current events, expanding her view and understanding of the world beyond America. On July 19th, 1850, as she returned home from Europe with her husband and 2-year-old son, Margaret Fuller's ship was caught in a storm off the coast of Fire Island, New York. During the 12 hours that the waves tore at the broken ship, Margaret Fuller clung to her 2-year-old son, Angelino, singing to him to calm his terror. On the shore, people could see folks on the boat, the ship, but the storm was too fierce. There was no way to rescue. As she clung to her son, writer, spiritual guide, and teacher Margaret Fuller was also a mother. And that night, mother, child, and husband perished. Her body was never found. Margaret Fuller was just 40 years old. We lost an extraordinary woman who shaped our greater spirit, our collective consciousness, and what has evolved into our contemporary Unitarian Universalist faith. As biographer E. Kornfeld so beautifully stated, in her lifelong quest for complete humanity, Margaret Fuller provoked her generation and still speaks powerfully to ours. The Reverend Dr. Tendeka writes, Margaret Fuller taught America how to think, feel, and act with non-dogmatic, life-affirming integrity. She showed Americans how the human heart transforms liberal faith into action. Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.